Good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Case. I'm one of the founders of Asia Edit, and I'm based in Hong Kong, where we set the company up 25 years ago now. Today, Dr. Rachel Barron is presenting the webinar on the impact of AI on academic research and publishing. Rachel is our managing editor of Social Sciences and has been working with Asia Edit since 2001. So that's a very healthy 20-year plus relationship there. Rachel studied at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom and achieved a first-class honours degree in psychology. She also got a master's in psychological research methods and has a PhD from the same university. Rachel currently teaches psychology at an English-speaking university in Italy, where she's now based. And with her extensive experience in both academia and publishing, Rachel has an excellent overview of both the client and editor sides of the business. Now, we've been avidly following the developments in AI, especially since the release of ChatGPT in November 2022. And like you, we've been trying to get a handle on where this will take us. Well, we've been testing a few tools, and here are some of our findings. So Rachel, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I'm just going to start sharing my screen before I start speaking. Just one moment. Okay. So, as Nick said, the rollout of ChatGPT in November last year took the world by storm. Like, I don't think there can be anybody that hasn't heard of all the amazing things that it can do. The media has been absolutely full of news about how it was going to change the world, revolutionize communication, and threaten all our jobs with the ability to automate the generation and analysis of content and data. Among the hype, AI offers many significant breakthroughs that will have a truly significant impact on our lives. I think many of us have signed up so that we could find out what all the hype was about. It can be really great fun asking ChatGPT to answer all kinds of questions that we've always wanted to know the answer to, or asking it to produce poems and prose in the style of our favourite authors and other fun things that can amuse us. But the question for those of us working in academia is whether it can be a useful tool that will speed up the process of scientific research and education. It can be confusing to read so many articles extolling the benefits and pitfalls of using AI to assist us in our daily work. So in this webinar, we aim to provide an overview of where the technology currently stands in relation to the process of writing scientific papers. Whilst we can't provide a comprehensive review of all that AI can do, we hope that you find some of our findings and suggestions useful. So before I go on to the main part of the webinar, we just have a quick poll that we'd like you to join in if possible. Okay, so if you could answer, have you used ChatGPT or ChatGPT-based tools for any research purpose? Just a simple yes or no answer. Felix, I can't see the answers coming. Can you?
Yes, I can. I've got them all here. Maybe okay. I'll give a response here. So nearly everybody has responded. I've got an 85% participation rate at the moment. Excellent. And it is split. 57% say yes, but quite a large number. It's going up. 58% say yes, and the rest have not used it so far.
Okay, so around 40% of people haven't yet used it for research purposes. That's really good for us to know. It's nice to know where everybody stands on this subject at the moment. How many of you have got experience with it already, and how many new converts there might be? Okay, so let's start. There are many different kinds of AI writing and editing tools. ChatGPT isn't the first or only one that's available to help with writing and editing. Some of them are more useful than others and offer various advantages and disadvantages. At one end of the spectrum, we have things like Grammarly that's built into Word. Word has its own spelling and grammar checking ability, as you know, but you can also add plugins like Grammarly that are much better than Word's own features. At the next stage, we have things that are called paraphrasing tools. There's one, the one I've suggested here is called Quillbot. These kind of tools can be used to generate alternative versions of text to reduce similarity that can be picked up as plagiarism. We don't really recommend the use of these tools for academic writing because they often produce meaningless alternatives using inappropriate synonyms that make the scientific content unintelligible. So they can be quite good for getting ideas about how to rephrase a sentence, but most of the time I wouldn't want to use the suggestions that they make. At the far end of the spectrum is tools like ChatGPT. So these are the most sophisticated tools. They're called large language models. And the most famous, say, is ChatGPT, which we're going to focus on in this webinar. So I just wanted to give you that overview just to make you realize that you have probably already used AI tools, even if you haven't used ChatGPT yet. So what is ChatGPT? Let's just give you a quick overview first. It's a large language model developed by OpenAI. It's a type of artificial intelligence designed to generate human-like text or chat based on the input it's given. It's trained on a large corpus of text from the internet. So basically it's exposed to a lot of text that's already published on the internet so that it can learn patterns and rules about language use. Once trained, it works by predicting which word is most likely to come next in a sentence. So in other words, it takes account of all these different patterns in the language that it sees and tries to work out how to put language together. In doing so, it learns to basically to predict the next word in a sentence. So it's not really doing anything more clever than that. It's basically predicting the next word that should come next. ChatGPT stands for Chat Generative Pre-Training Transformer. The chat part refers to its focus on generating conversational responses. Generative pre-training refers to the two-stage process used to train it, and transformer refers to the type of machine learning model it's based on. It's known for its ability to handle sequential data, so it's a particular type of machine learning. The latest version of ChatGPT is version 4, and you need to pay a $20 a month subscription to use this one, but the version 3.5 is free and it's sufficient for most tasks that you'll need. So let's now look at it in a bit more detail. So in the pre-training phase of ChatGPT, it's trained on a large corpus of text from the internet, as I said. However, it doesn't know specifics about which documents were part of its training set, and it doesn't have access to any private or confidential information, so its knowledge base is not comprehensive. In particular, as most academic research is published in journals that only allow access to subscribers, its knowledge of the scientific literature is quite limited in comparison to its broader knowledge about the world. During the initial training stage, it learns to predict the next word in a sentence. So, for example, given the input, the sky is, it might learn to predict the word blue. Of course, that's a very simplistic example. It does a lot more sophisticated things than that. Through this process, it learns grammar and facts about the world and even some of the biases present in the text that it was trained on. So it can actually duplicate all of the things on the internet that are incorrect or biased or whatever, because it's not trying to make sense of them in any way. It's literally just duplicating the language patterns in that text. It's really important to note that it was trained on text only up until 2021. So its factual knowledge is not completely up to date. the implications of this limitation are evident in some of its output, as we'll see a bit later. After the initial stage, it goes through a fine-tuning stage where ChatGPT is fine-tuned on a narrower data set generated with the help of human reviewers. These reviewers follow guidelines provided by OpenAI to review and rate possible outputs for a range of example input. So this process helps shape the model's behavior and ensures it's safe and useful. So in other words, it tries to correct some of the model's errors. It tries to make the answers more relevant and tries to eliminate any kind of content that would be unsafe to repeat. However, it's important to note that it doesn't understand text. It can only learn patterns and relationships between textual elements. This is very, very different from the way a human processes language. We always focus on making meaning out of words. ChatGPT is literally only interested in the patterns in the words. In the next phase, the generating phase, the user provides an input like a question or a statement, and ChatGPT generates a response by predicting what comes next, word by word, until it reaches a specific length or the end of a sentence. It uses what it learned during both the pre-training and fine-tuning stages to generate these responses. To use ChatGPT, all you need to do is open an account. You can use most of the features for free, but as I say, a paid account gives you access to the more later version, and that has some additional features and add-ons. The latest version, version 4, can handle more complex information and prompts, and the character limit is higher, so longer chunks of text can be entered. So it is worth paying for it if you want to do anything more sophisticated than really just playing around with it. When you open the program, you'll be invited to type a prompt into the chat box, just like interacting with the kind of chatbots we're used to seeing on websites. Example prompts might include summarize the content of the following article, or reduce the following abstract to 250 words or less. Can you suggest some novel research ideas on the topic of whatever? We'll come to lots more prompts in a while. Writing good prompts is the key to good output. So the prompts that you use, the way that you type your prompts in, the words that you use, make a huge difference to the quality of the output. So you really do need to experiment with the kinds of prompts that work best for different purposes. The chat box represents an ongoing conversation so that you can respond to its output with a follow-up question. You can ask for clarification or elaboration, and in this way you can refine the output until it gives you exactly what you need. However, a fair bit of work can sometimes be needed before you get the output you want, which has led to questions about how time-saving it really is for complex tasks. Of course, the ability to generate the most effective prompts itself depends on having a good command of English. So how can it be used in research and writing? So I would say that it can be used at almost every stage of the research process, from generating ideas for new research to developing hypotheses and study designs and proofreading manuscripts. It's much better at some of these tasks than others, and I would be very cautious about using it for some, whilst others I think it will do a very good job and you don't need to be too concerned about it. This diagram is taken from a book chapter by Zoe 2023. The reference is on the slide. It divides the research process into 4 main areas: research conception, academic writing, editing and proofreading, and academic publishing. And within these areas, there are more fine-grained tasks. So such as journal style formatting, citation checking, data interpretation, meta-analysis or summarization. So various different tasks that you can do associated with the 4 main groupings. We obviously don't have time to cover all of these areas in this short webinar, so we're going to start with a few ideas about how to use ChatGPT for research conception, so this part up here. And we'll look at some examples of its output. Then we'll briefly look at some of the issues you might encounter when using it to help with writing a paper, in particular the literature review. Then we'll look at its use for improving writing, editing, and proofreading, and review our feedback on some of the findings from our testing over the past few months. So, research conception. ChatGPT can be useful in the initial stages of reviewing the literature or trying to find ideas about topics that you might be interested in researching. It can produce summaries that provide a broader overview of a field or topic. It can be used to brainstorm ideas when planning or researching new projects. And there are plugin tools to help you do this by doing things such as producing mind maps and other visual representations. So some ideas for the kind of prompts that you might use in these early stages of identifying a research topic. You might want to ask it, can you summarize the literature on XXX and identify some research gaps? What are the hottest research topics in whatever field currently? I'm interested in studying XXX. Can you suggest an appropriate novel hypothesis? Can you suggest some ideas for novel research in the area of XXX? I have the following idea for a study. Could you suggest a suitable research design specifying the type of study, the sample size, and the analysis methods? So as you can see, these prompts vary quite a lot in the amount of detail and the amount of sophistication in what they're asking ChatGPT to do. It can handle complex questions like this very well, and it tends to follow the instructions quite perfectly most of the time. So just to give an example, I asked it, what are the hottest topics in cognitive psychology today? Cognitive psychology being the area that I used to work in. It produced some interesting ideas, such as social justice and mental health, positive psychology and resilience, and the psychology of misinformation. These are all interesting topics. However, its first two answers were quite revealing of one of its greatest limitations, the fact that it's only trained on data up to 2021. In this case, it identified mental health and COVID-19, and teletherapy and digital mental health interventions as the top two topics, so the two hottest topics in cognitive psychology. I would argue that since 2021, these topics have probably fallen quite a lot further down the top 10 list or the list of hottest topics because they are specifically relevant to that time. So you do have to be careful, as I say, that you have to be aware that the information it provides is not necessarily right up to the minute. So next I gave it a prompt, can you produce a novel idea for researching cognitive psychology? And then it answered, investigating the effects of digital overload on cognitive functions and mental health. This answer is so broad and generic that when I typed the keywords into Google Scholar, it returned more than 56,000 results, so hardly a novel idea. I refined the prompt to suggest a novel research question on the effects of digital overload on cognitive functions and mental health. And ChatGPT's answer was, what are the long-term effects of sustained digital overload characterized by excessive screen time, information overload, and constant multitasking on cognitive functions and mental health outcomes in different age groups? So here we have a reasonable research question. I think it's much more useful than the broad generic question that it came up first. And that, as I say, is a result of the kind of prompt that you give it. You have to play around with the prompts to make sure that you get something useful. It also, after having provided the research question, will give an explanation of it. So it provides a little bit more detail about this, what it's proposing. I followed this up by asking ChatGPT to suggest a potential research design. And although it's a plausible design and it would be feasible to run such a study, a closer look shows that it really doesn't provide anything more than a basic outline with highly generic statements. So, for example, the participants section here, sorry, it's very small. I just was trying to give you an overview rather than expecting you to read it in detail. For participants, it says a diverse sample of individuals from different age groups, for example, children, adolescents, and adults. And for the sample size, it says determine an appropriate sample size based on power analysis and the specific research objectives. So these are not really ideas about how to select participants or which ones will be most suitable. They're just really highly generic statements that don't really get you any further than you would have been before you asked it the question. The same goes for several of the other sections, especially the ethical considerations and the limitations. So it tells you that you need to obtain informed consent from participants and ensure confidentiality of their data. While that's very true, I don't think any of us would ever consider conducting human research without such consent. So we hardly need ChatGPT to tell us that. The data collection and analysis sections are probably the most useful and provide a reasonable starting point for selecting some appropriate measures and statistical analysis techniques. So there is some use in what it's produced, but I wouldn't say it's detailed or specific enough to really move you much further on. So how good are its suggestions overall? On the pro side, it's highly useful for students and early career researchers for developing a basic understanding of complex topics. It's also helpful for overcoming language barriers and making research more accessible. It can provide inspiration and ideas, prompts you to think outside the box. So in other words, if you're getting a bit stuck, you can't really decide which direction to go in, you're just overwhelmed with too many ideas or not enough ideas, then I think ChatGPT can be really useful to produce something more concrete for you to start working on. It can also be useful to cross-link between disciplines. So often it's quite nice to expand your research area by looking at what's happening in other disciplines and whether there's a possibility to work with other teams. And so you can look at you can ask ChatGPT to suggest how developments in one field relate to findings in another. I think that's probably a quite nice question to, or if you're interested in that kind of research, be a nice question to ask it. The cons are that the level of specificity and novelty is rather low. A lot more work is needed after generating a response from ChatGPT. The ideas produced tend to lack detail. They don't include any references, and so you'll still need to do a literature search and review after getting your output from ChatGPT. A study by Lahat et al. Investigated the use of ChatGPT for generating research ideas in 4 gastroenterology topics. This is in a peer-reviewed paper. When the topics were reviewed by experts, they found them to be excellent in terms of relevance and clarity, but they were not particularly original or specific. So somewhat useful, but again, as I found with my questions, they were quite generic and didn't really advance anything that I'd already known. The output of ChatGPT can be improved somewhat by the use of plugins. So since it was introduced, various developers have been busy working on producing these kind of plugins, and some of them I think are really, really useful. I think the most useful one I would say is called Scholar AI. This gives ChatGPT the capability to search more than 40 million peer-reviewed papers from open access journals, and you can even save the results to reference management software. It'll search for topics and suggest references, and then you can ask it to summarize their content, review the quality of the research, and so on. I think this is probably the most useful plugin that I've tried so far, and I would recommend giving it a try. Another one is called Browser Pilot. This can summarize the content of web pages, and this is really good because it partially overcomes the limitation of its training data cutoff. So like I said before, it wasn't trained on anything after 2021. So by asking it to analyze the content of more up-to-date web pages, you can make the output more up-to-date. AI PDF is another tool that I think you'll find really useful. So if you want to evaluate a published paper, for instance, in PDF form, you can use AI PDF or a similar plugin to analyze the text in the PDF. This is something that you couldn't do without the plugin, and the text from a paper would be too long. There's a word limit to how many characters ChatGPT will accept, so without these kind of tools, you can't ask it to analyze an entire paper. So I advise you to play around with these kind of add-ins. Wolfram is another one. It's based on computational and mathematical knowledge, and it can analyze and visualize data. I actually don't have much knowledge of how this works. I haven't used it myself, but I know that it is a well-established and frequently used tool, and it's just recently been embedded in ChatGPT for ease of use. So just to give you an idea of the difference in the output that it gives when you use one of the plugins, this is the response from ChatGPT using Scholar AI when I asked it to produce an interesting research question. As you can see, it now accesses specific published studies. So it's looking at a specific study here, and it provides a link to the full text of it. So it can analyze the content of them to identify the specific research questions. So based on the content of this paper, it comes up with the question, how can BDIs be optimized to mitigate the effects of digital overload on cognitive functions and mental health in students? These references, I will come to the problem with ChatGPT and references in a moment, but just to reassure you that these references are real, and the links work, so they do take you to the actual original articles, and this makes it much easier to access and then assess the quality of the research on which the suggestion was based. Without AI Scholar, you will not get, or very often not get, these kind of real references, so it will be very hard to follow up and find out more detail about whatever it is that you're researching. However, I do warn you that as Scholar AI can only refer to open access journals, the quality of the research can be quite variable. So it's really important to assess it before deciding whether its suggestions are valid. It hardly needs pointing out that no scholar would rely exclusively on open access journals to understand the literature on an entire topic. So it's very useful, but still limited. This is a screenshot from the output of this is actual ChatGPT screen, showing the response to a request to summarize an article using a link reader plugin. Okay, so this is one where I've given it a link to an article on the internet and asked it to summarize the article. The paper is actually about whether it's possible to tell the difference between human and AI-generated abstracts. We're going to come back to this later. In the meantime, we can see that it produces a nice, clear, easy to read summary that would save a lot of time in reviewing the paper for inclusion in a literature review. It's only a brief outline, so if you wanted to use the paper, you would still probably want to go back and review it in depth. But I think it's a really good way to help select and eliminate papers for full review. So if you did this with lots of different papers, I think you would very quickly be able to sort them into useful and unuseful. So now let's move on to the next stage of the research process, actually writing a literature review. And I think here we have another poll. So for those of you that have already used ChatGPT, have you ever used it for exploring and or reviewing the literature? So this is a more specific question than the last one, asking if you've used it for this particular task.
Okay. Yeah, we do have quite a few questions that are right before this.
Okay.
Asking if we can use ChatGPT to find relevant literature, to write literature reviews. So yeah, so it's quite a hot topic here.
Yeah.
Okay, so the response this time, we've got around about 60% of people responding. Most people have not used it for literature review, so 81% have not used it for literature review.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And presumably that 60% response is the 60% of people who have already used ChatGPT, as the others obviously have not used it.
Yes.
Okay, Okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay, so I think ChatGPT has the potential to be really useful for writing literature reviews. It has an extensive, but certainly not exhaustive knowledge base to work on, and it can be highly effective in synthesizing complex research findings. It can evaluate the quality of studies, including their design, methodology, sample size, and statistical analyses. So there's plenty that you can ask it to help you with. It won't, however, search the internet for published content in the same way that Google and other search engines do. So it can only refer to the data it was originally trained on, and that means developments after 2021 will not be incorporated. So as I say, you do need to bear this in mind at all times, that you are working with somewhat outdated information. I've just given some example prompts for a literature review. You could, of course, just ask ChatGPT to write an entire literature review on the topic that you're interested in. However, I really wouldn't advise it. I think this is unlikely to generate a very useful response, as it's too broad and it would require far too much fact checking. These are some example prompts that you could use to ask more specific questions about particular studies, and which should provide you with some useful ideas and sample text to include in your review. So you could ask, for instance, to summarize a paper, ask it how the findings of 2 studies differ, ask it to highlight the implications of a study for government policy, summarize the main findings of the study, and so on. On the next page, I have a few more. I put a few up, like these are for you to reference later on if you want to, just to give you some ideas. So you could also ask it to summarize the main methodologies used in a study on whatever topic, summarizing the strengths and weaknesses of a theoretical model, ask what theoretical frameworks have been developed in a particular field. So as you can see, these are kind of all exploratory kind of ideas that can be an excellent starting point for thinking about your literature review. However, we really don't advise you to rely on it without checking the original sources. We'll come to more of that in a moment. As I say, there are potential problems that could arise from asking ChatGPT to help you with the literature review. The main one, I think, is that the generated content may be inaccurate and it needs to be fact-checked. It's known to create what are called hallucinations that can be difficult to detect. It might confidently embed a supposed fact into its generated content unless you're highly familiar with the source and an expert on the subject matter. There's no way of detecting the error. So in other words, it can sound extremely plausible while inventing something that is completely untrue. So ultimately, if you need to check everything that it tells you, how much time is it really going to save you? I'm going to give you an example of a hallucination in just a moment. Another problem is that it tends to miss nuances and complexities, so the review can seem quite artificial. Even if its facts are broadly correct, it doesn't really understand the topic in a way that a human does, so it's unlikely to be able to make decisions about what information is and isn't useful. It almost always oversimplifies topics, and this can be really helpful when you just want a broad overview, just when you want to start understanding the particular topic. But when you want to go more in depth, it tends to lose the detail that would be truly useful in a literature review. I've briefly touched before on the fact that it can reproduce prejudices and biases in its original data set. So this may not be a particular problem for you, for your paper specifically, but in a broader sense, this can become a highly problematic issue because it's going to reinforce these prejudices and biases every time they're reproduced. So you can imagine it's trained on some biased data. It uses that training data to reproduce its own biases, and so on and so on. They just proliferate the more it produces them. So this can be quite problematic, I think. This is an example of a hallucination. There's countless examples that you can find on the internet. They can often be very amusing, but they also have the potential for serious harm. So how would you feel if you included a hallucination such as this in a paper you were writing for publication? In this case, the researcher, Jerome Goddard, asked a question about where female ticks might choose to lay their eggs and how far they would travel to do so. In its response, ChatGPT claimed that ticks could travel several hundred meters to find the correct site, although the researcher knew this was highly unlikely. When it asked to provide a supporting reference for the statement, ChatGPT confidently produced one, stating, "Certainly, here is a scientific paper that investigates the distance that engorged female Ambyloma americanum ticks can travel before selecting a site for egg laying." However, when the researchers checked the DOI, it didn't exist. And when Goddard wrote to the supposed authors of that paper, they had no knowledge of the paper at all. It was totally fabricated. So this is just one of many examples that have been reported in peer-reviewed journals, as well as on countless websites. We can't overstate the level of caution you need to have when using ChatGPT to generate content such as this. There are also potential ethical problems. So there's a very real valid concern that using ChatGPT for writing could introduce inadvertent plagiarism. It may produce sentences and phrases that are highly similar to existing papers, mainly because it's looking for and reproducing common language problems. And it's also notoriously bad at dealing with references. If you ask it to include references in a summary of research, for example, it will confidently do so, as we've just seen, but they're almost always entirely fictitious. Again, this is because of the way it works. It's not looking for a reference associated with a specific fact, but for the most likely word or name that follows the fact based on its training data. In general, it just doesn't understand the academic convention of providing references for all information well enough to avoid plagiarism. And even when it tries to mimic that style, it invents the references. So using it for writing may also pose ethical concerns about the authorship of the work. Journals don't allow ChatGPT to be listed as an author. You remain responsible for verifying all of its output. If you have relied extensively on ChatGPT to write your paper, you are potentially committing fraud if you claim it as your own work. If you do use ChatGPT to help write your article, you'll be expected to acknowledge it in a similar way to how you would acknowledge other kinds of assistance and state that you take full responsibility for the content. However, by doing so, you might raise questions about your academic seriousness and commitment, since views on the acceptability of AI in the scientific community are still strongly divided. Nevertheless, views on this might change in the future as AI becomes more commonplace in all aspects of our lives. There are also concerns over data security and privacy. So there's a slight but real possibility that data that you input into it might be subject to data leaks and breaches of privacy. There have been a few high-profile cases where this has happened. Most of the time, such leaks wouldn't be of great concern, as the information is not usually very sensitive. Cyber attacks are usually aimed at retrieving users' personal information, and the threat with ChatGPT is no different from it would be with any other kind of website that collected your personal information. However, in some cases, you might be more concerned about your data getting into the wrong hands and potentially having your work stolen by somebody else. So if you're inputting the data from a new study or ideas, or you've written about something that has never been written before, there's a very, very small possibility that this could get into the wrong hands, and that you could potentially lose your intellectual property rights over over whatever it is that you've entered into ChatGPT. A question that's been asked is whether it's possible to detect AI written text. So as I just kind of cast doubt on whether you might want to actually use ChatGPT for extensively writing your rich literature review. If you did so, what would happen? It's actually very hard to detect because the quality of the output's so good in terms of language and grammar and structure and so on. So any human reading AI generated text probably wouldn't recognize it unless they suspected it was being used. So in other words, if they had a suspicion in the first place, then they might be able to tell AI generated from non-AI generated text. There's a study by Gao et al., the reference is here, in which they generated 50 medical abstracts with AI, and they asked blinded human reviewers to identify which ones were human and which ones AI generated. The human reviewers were able to correctly identify 68% of AI-generated abstracts and correctly identified 86% of original articles as being original. However, they incorrectly identified 32% of generated abstracts as real and 40% of original abstracts as being generated. So it's not completely accurate. People aren't completely accurate. These were blinded human reviewers that knew that they were trying to identify AI text. So they had a good clue in the first place that half of the text would be AI generated, and they still didn't identify it all of the time. Nevertheless, there are lots of tools that are able to claim they are able to detect AI written text. So, for instance, Turnitin, Winston AI, and CopyLeaks. All these are kind of usually plagiarism tools that universities and journal publishers might use to check for plagiarism in your paper when you submit it. And they all claim to have detection rates of around 99%. So I'm not sure, I haven't checked that. I haven't personally experienced it. So it just seems that if you're hoping to get away with using ChatGPT in your work, be aware that these kind of tools are very likely to detect it. Okay, so now let's move on to the final part, which is using AI for editing and proofreading. This is obviously where we have the most experience. We've been extensively testing ChatGPT since its launch. Some editing companies we know are already offering AI-assisted editing services. However, we've been conducting our own behind-the-scenes tests, and we don't believe the technology is yet ready to roll out to our clients. When we've tried the services offered by other companies, they seem to be set up mainly to proofread rather than to edit. So they're probably adequate for checking an already well-written document, but not for improving the overall readability of papers written by ESL learners in English as a second language learners. It's possible to use ChatGPT prompts that result in much more thorough editing, and the results generally read very well. It corrects almost all grammar errors and improves syntax and vocabulary use, making the text more readable and sophisticated. However, we've identified many problems with the output, and some of them quite severe. So we don't currently view it as offering any improvement on our human editing, and nor does it save any time for us. At the moment, there are no cost savings, or there would be no cost savings for us to pass on to you to make it worthwhile as using it. Let's have a look at what it does when asked to edit. This is an example of what I believe is a well-edited paragraph. So this is the original here. As you can see, if you've got time to read outside the webinar, we don't have time to read it in detail at the moment. You'll see that the writing can definitely be improved on, and this is the edited version. It's much more succinct. It's much shorter. It's the syntax, the word order is improved, so it's much easier to read. It doesn't contain any grammatical or spelling errors. However, it's also worth noting that even in this well-edited excerpt, ChatGPT doesn't correct the inclusion of page numbers in the references. So here we can see these page numbers here are left in, and here, they're left in. Now, a human editor would have removed these because page numbers are only needed in a reference when there is a direct quote. So ChatGPT, as I say, doesn't really understand references very well, so it's left those in. So it's not quite done as good a job as a human editor might. It's really a minor point, but it does highlight the fact that no AI edited text is ready for submission without further checking and editing. So some of the problems that we found with editing text. One of the big problems that we found is that it tends to delete massive sections of text and just replace them with a brief summary. So we might have like a 2,500 word literature review that could be condensed down to 250 words. So very succinct, very easy to read, but really not the point of a literature review. So that kind of incident makes it completely useless for editing. And we obviously have to try different prompts to get it not to do that, but we're still working on that. It has a tendency to over-edit in general. So many of the edits that ChatGPT makes are subjective and unnecessary. Our editors tend to work very closely with the author's text. We try not to change stylistic things that don't need changing. We don't try to change synonyms just for the sake of it. So we try to, as I say, keep the author's style as much as we possibly can. It also tends to remove lots of details. So we often came across things like the sample size being deleted or the details of an experimental design. So again, it would come up with a very nice sentence. It would read very well, but you would have lost the important detail that you really need in your paper. It would often change the meaning of things as well. So especially when the original was poorly written or ambiguous, we found that it would rearrange the words to create something that made sense using those words or similar ones, but it didn't necessarily have any relation to the meaning of the original text. As human editors, we are used to dealing with ambiguous wording, and we take into account the whole context of the paper and our knowledge about the topic, and we try different ways of constructing sentences until we get what we think is as close as possible to the author's meaning. But ChatGPT doesn't do this. It will just find a plausible sentence that it can make. It will also do things like changing the author's style. As I said, we try and work with the author author style as much as possible. So some people prefer not to use the first person when they're writing scientific papers, whereas we would stick with that. ChatGPT might well introduce the first person, and so you find yourself having a paper that's written using we or I. A few more problems. It's not very good at dealing with verb tense. Again, this is kind of bread and butter for our editors. We understand how difficult it is for authors whose first language isn't English to understand the complexities of English verb tense. So we follow not just rules, but we use our knowledge about verb tense and how the subtleties of it in different sections of the paper. So it's not a case of just correcting to past tense or present tense or whatever. There are subtleties. And in one section of the paper, it might be appropriate to use one tense, whereas in another section of the paper, we'd expect to use another tense. ChatGPT just does not understand this. So it's the verb tense changes it makes will often introduce errors, and almost certainly doesn't correct errors and inconsistencies. So it might correct them within the sentence, but it doesn't correct them within the overall structure of the paper. It tends to remove citations. This, as I say, it's really bad at handling references, and it likes to just summarize things without keeping the citation. So you will find having to go back and re-input all of the citations that ChatGPT has used during its editing. Even worse, came across several instances where it paraphrases direct quotes. So it takes out the quotation marks, it paraphrases the text and deletes the citation. So here we, depending on the amount of paraphrasing, we now have some text here that is very close to being plagiarized, because we've used the original quote, but it's not attributed to the original author. So this is obviously a very serious thing to look out for, and you would really seriously want to check for any direct quotes that you would inserted in the text to make sure that they were still presented as such. It tends to repeat or introduce errors that our editors will correct. Some of these might seem trivial, but we pride ourselves on our excellent English grammar, our English usage. There are a lot of things that you will read in published papers, on the internet, in books, wherever, that are not strictly correct, but we obviously like to correct them. So one thing that we look at is a lot of authors use on the other hand to make a contrast without using on the one hand in the before it. So it makes no sense. You can't have a contrast on another hand unless you've had the one hand. So you have to have the two. Of course, because it's so common to use just on the other hand, ChatGPT will happily repeat that mistake. It also has a poor understanding of definite articles. So a definite article is the, or indefinite article and so on. It's very poor at understanding where these need to go. So it will tend to either put them in erroneously or it will miss them out. More often, I find it just missed them out. Finally, it doesn't query things that a human editor would. So as we are editing, we always do things like, if you've had a paper edited by us, you'll know that we write comments in the margin pointing out things like ambiguities in the text. So this gives you an opportunity to correct something that we think is unclear. We can edit it, but we ask you to just check that we haven't changed the meaning. Or we might ask you for more information so that we can correct it properly. It doesn't question factual, it doesn't make factual queries. So sometimes we can tell that dates are incorrect or they might be inconsistent. So different dates given at different points in the paper. So we would query that and ask the author to check which one was correct. It doesn't query where there's missing information. So we often ask authors to add, for instance, the name of manufacturers when mentioning equipment. We would ask for missing information about where participants were recruited from, for instance, and so on and so on. Of course, ChatGPT wouldn't do any of these things. It also, of course, doesn't ask for missing references, where again, we would put a note in saying, a comment in saying, please provide a reference here when we think something needs to be attributed. It also, finally, doesn't correct inconsistencies as well as a human editor. So again, our editors go through a paper, keeping in mind things like whether abbreviations have already been defined and whether the full term is used again after that. They make those kind of corrections so that there's consistency. If numbers are presented in words or in numerals, our editors will spot that and they will correct it so that every use of numbers is presented in the same way. Again, like ChatGPT may do this in a localized way, so it may do it within a sentence or even within adjoining sentences, but it doesn't seem to be able to do it throughout the whole paper to make it all consistent. Okay, just before we end, I'm just going to show you this example of a section that was edited by ChatGPT to show you some of the problems in just one particular section here. This excerpt is from a research grant proposal, and we can see that the paragraph describing the samples, I don't know if this is large enough for you to read, but this first paragraph is all about how the sample size will be calculated. It contains information about the previous study that the sample size calculation was based on, and it provides a reference and so on and so on. ChatGPT has basically reduced it to the sample size calculation based on a previous study on acupressure for sleep quality determined that 35 participants are required per group to achieve 80% power, etc. So it's lost all of this detail here. Not only is this level of detail very important in a research grant proposal, but the reference to the previous study on which it was based has been removed. So it's basically made the information scientifically meaningless. Any reviewer looking at this would not accept, I don't think, this lack of detail in a grant proposal application. In the next paragraph here, most of the text has been deleted. It has actually been partially rewritten down here, but it's been, and although it reads very well, it reads like a nicely written paragraph. It has once again deleted important information, not just those relating to, and the references have been deleted, relating to previous studies and also relating to the published measures. So again, this is unacceptable in a scientific paper. We just couldn't, I'm sure if you received this back as an edited piece of work from us, you would be fairly livid that we had managed to lose so much of the detail that you had laboriously worked hard to include. So in summary, why we're not yet converts. Okay, there are two main reasons for our decision not to introduce AI-assisted editing yet. These can be divided into quality issues and practical issues. In terms of quality, if we were to use ChatGPT in place of a human editor, we would need to go through the paper comparing the edited version with the original to reinstate all of the incorrectly deleted information and check for any errors that might have been introduced in the process of the editing. Even the parts that were edited without deletion would need to be checked for changes of meaning, which we come across often. As you can imagine, this would probably take longer than it would for us to edit the paper from scratch. Even then, there'd be a high probability of introducing factual errors or distortions. We still couldn't be certain that we had caught all potential errors. Distortions of meaning are particularly hard to pick up in edited text, and ChatGPT is much more likely to distort meaning than a human editor. The problem of distorted or changed meaning is even more likely given the tendency to over-edit. As human editors, as I've mentioned several times, we always try to remain faithful to the author's original text. We preserve the author's style and voice. ChatGPT completely overrides almost all author preferences and imposes its own generic style. We don't believe our clients would be happy with such wholesale changes. It also makes too many assumptions and doesn't query text, so it doesn't write the comments, as I was just talking about. So you would get, I think, a lower quality of input from ChatGPT. In terms of practical issues, there's still a number of technological limitations that need to be overcome. First, there's a limitation on the number of words that can be entered in any one prompt. So it's not possible to edit a whole paper at once. There are some ways of getting around this limitation, but they're all somewhat fiddly. No doubt this will be fixed sometime in the future, but for the moment, it does limit its usability. Another issue is that once the editing is completed in the app, the text needs to be copied into Word and compared with the original so that the editing shows us track changes. Again, this can be overcome, but it is time consuming. We believe that an add-in for Word is expected in the near future, which should hopefully resolve this issue and make at least that aspect easier for us. We're also still concerned about data leakages too. We don't want to compromise the security of your original research and ideas, so we'll only ever offer the service to clients who are happy to clients who are happy to accept the admittedly very small risk. And finally, we need to understand more about how authors, journal editors, and readers view the use of ChatGPT in producing academic papers. Opinions are probably divided between those who think it's an excellent tool that should be widely used to improve and speed up the research process, while others may have the completely opposite view and see any such assistance as unethical. Such concerns bring up the issue of transparency. Would you be happy to include an acknowledgement of ChatGPT's involvement in editing your paper? Ultimately, though, we'll be guided by our clients, and if and when we get to a point where there's a demand for an AI-assisted editing service, and it's feasible and cost effective for us to provide it, we will offer it as one of our options. Okay, I think we have one final poll before we conclude and go to questions and answers.
Felix, yes. Okay, so now that you've attended this webinar, do you plan to use ChatGPT or other AI-based tools for any research purposes in future? Very quick, a lot of people tapping here. We are hovering at 75, 76, 75%. So yeah, 75% saying yes, they do plan to use ChatGPT going forwards.
Okay.
78 is it's growing, so we're edging towards 80%.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
All right. So I wonder if that means that that I have persuaded some of you of the usefulness of ChatGPT. It sounds like I might have done.
I'm certainly that would reflect. I mean, some of the comments I've received here, and I think this is very valid. You know, they're saying, well, of course, ChatGPT can only get better, right?
Yes.
So in the future, and the conclusion to Jinge has written, the advantage of AI is it can improve itself further and further. The conclusion to draw today might be not true in a few years, right? And
Absolutely. Yes.
That's what we're saying. I mean,
we can only talk about where we are at the moment, and of course, like the speed at which things are changing, I think really means that we will just see rapid changes over the next few months and years. So it's definitely something I recommend you to start playing with it now, and then as the changes come along, you will just see it become more and more sophisticated, I think. But I think there will always be things that it can't do. I don't think we or anybody else sees it replacing humans for the kind of things that we do as researchers and editors. I think there'll always be a place for humans in it.
Yeah, I mean, Charmaine here, she I think very astute observation. Yes, we should use it, but with caution. I think that's exactly what you've been driving at today. I mean, I'll just try to sort of summarize some of what you've covered there. I mean, it seems certainly for an early career academic. Maybe if you can end your slideshow there, Rachel, then we'll take up the whole screen. At the moment, we've still got that blocking up the screen. There you go. Oh, it's still there.
Is it? Okay.
I can see the page. But we can. That's it. It's gone now. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, for an early career academic, I think it's quite useful in sort of generating checklists, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, some of the things you said, yeah, we would never carry out any research without getting the sign off by the participants. Perhaps someone who's not so familiar with research, you know, at the beginning of their career, they wouldn't have thought of that. So I think it's quite good at coming up with checklists for someone at the start of their career, things that you might take for granted, they may not have knowledge of. So I think that's certainly useful. And you know, cross-linking disciplines also, I think, a very useful tool there, which I hadn't considered before you mentioned it today.
I think it's really interesting because like, when you get stuck, I think sometimes, like especially you know, for even undergraduate students, but postgraduate students as well, like just to be able to broaden your ideas and find out about stuff out there that you you know, you just want to explore stuff really. And I think it's absolutely brilliant for that, like just get some ideas. And especially for people whose first language isn't English, I think like it can be really good because the way that it summarizes things is much simpler to read than most academic papers. So you get a nice, easy to read summary that like you can really absorb the information and then go back to the paper maybe to read the kind of detail.
Yeah. One question here was the plugins that you mentioned, Scholar AI, AI PDF, etc. Are they free, or is there a paywall for them?
So they're only available with ChatGPT 4, and that has a $20 US a month charge for it. So once you subscribe to the ChatGPT at $20 a month, then you get access to the plugins.
Right. Although I know, I mean, I've used the AI PDF. Is it called PDF AI, whatever? That one, I think it's free if you do 3 or 4 PDFs a day. If you want to do any more than that, then you have to pay a monthly fee. So it seems that they all have sort of a free entry for you to trial it, to test it. Which I advise people to do it. It's good to play around with these tools and see how they can help. And if it is very useful, then yes, you'll find the entry level is not that expensive. It's not prohibitive, is it?
I think once you've had a basic play around with the basic version, with 3.5, it's really worth upgrading, because all the developments going into obviously the latest version. So you will see the advances in version 4 and beyond. Whereas I think ChatGPT 3.5 will remain reasonably static. So you're not going to see those improvements as they come out. So yeah, definitely worth the $20 a month if you can afford it.
Right. I mean, I guess one of the problems, one of the key problems at the moment, is that it is limited to knowledge up to September 2021. So it's 2 years out of date at the moment. Of course, that will, it'll update in time. But at the moment, it does mean if you ask any questions, you're missing the latest research.
Yeah, it does. It's constantly retrained on things that people put into it. So like as you enter text and things into it that can be used for retraining the newer models. So it's like all the time it's kind of being updated, but its original training data set was 2021, and of course that will become more and more out of date for its kind of basic knowledge as time goes on.
Right. And another thing, just drawing on your, because I'm trying to, there's so many questions up here, and I'm trying to summarize them into statements. I don't want to just read out all their questions. But I guess one of the ways to use ChatGPT effectively is to learn how to write good prompts. And the issue there is you need to have very good English in order to elicit the information that you're looking for. You can't just sort of ask it in poor English, give me a journal on, journal article on blah, because it just won't know what to do. You've got to be very, very specific on those prompts. And then once you've got that initial feedback from ChatGPT, to go further and then prompt it to give more info based on what it's already given you, something like that.
That's right. And I think, there are now training courses on what they call prompt engineering. I think people will start to go into careers as prompt engineers, because it will just become such an important part of trying to make the best of AI, really. So we are still obviously learning a lot ourselves, but you can see a huge difference in the output that you get with different prompts. The interesting thing, of course, is that if you've used ChatGPT, you will notice that at the bottom it's got what's called a regenerate button. So once you've got the response, if you don't like it, you just hit to regenerate, and it'll just do the thing again. You'll get completely different output. So it's interesting to see that anyway. But yeah, like just change the prompt a little bit and see what else you get. So sometimes you can, it's an incremental thing. You get your first response, and then you ask it to refine its answer based on what it gets, what it gives you, and then you ask another prompt, and then another and another, and eventually you should get, you should be able to narrow down to exactly what you want. I noticed there's a question there saying for the literature review prompts you showed, can you put all prompts into ChatGPT at the same time, or does it need to be done sequentially? So, so the answer to that is really that if you put them all in as one question, it might be confused. The answer might be confusing. I would recommend doing it sequentially. So like doing one, getting the answer, then adding another, and then adding another. You can put in complex questions, so you could add them together, but I wouldn't make it too complex, because
I've tried that. You get jargon, you end up with things that don't make sense.
Yeah.
And also, something you mentioned earlier, it's not a replacement for Google. So, when you put something into ChatGPT, just because it comes up with a statement doesn't mean that's true. That's quite key. I mean, I sat with a professor from HKUST, and she showed me the output of a question. She wanted to write an introduction to herself, and it said that, first of all, it said she was dead, which was clearly not true because she's sitting with me. And secondly, that she was in a field which she wasn't. It said she was in dentistry or something like that. So it just completely hallucinated her backstory, and it was laughable what it came up with. And another thing that you mentioned, you can't replace ChatGPT for quotes. So she also shared with me some examples of some of her students, some of her master's and PhD students, who had used ChatGPT as a reference. So, I mean, you said this specifically in the presentation just now, you can't do this. I just want to reiterate it because it's something that has happened. It seems more than a few times, people putting in their ChatGPT 2023 and saying that is the reference for what they've written in their paper. You can't do that.
Yeah, and I think that there's actually a question there in the chat box saying, how do we get students to credit ChatGPT when they do use it for their work? And I don't really know the answer to that, because I think it will have to depend on different universities' policies. I don't really know which way they're going on this. I know some universities are discouraging the use of ChatGPT. Others might ask you to write an acknowledgement of its use. I'm not quite sure, so I'm afraid I can't answer that.
I mean, some of it comes down to university policies, right? So some universities are banning the use of ChatGPT, and so in those cases, you can't even mention that you've used it, even if you have used it. You're answerable for what you put down on the paper. So yeah, I don't think there is a way to credit it as such, is there? Other functions like transferring data onto charts. I think these are plugins again. We haven't explored them, but there are some plugins that you can use to address that. But I can't advise that. Felix has got some ideas there, perhaps.
Yeah, there's definitely possible to do that, and I think one of the plugins I mentioned is very good at mathematics, but there's lots of things that will generate charts and things. So if you put data into it, it's very good at visualizing the data in various different ways. So yeah, definitely have a play around with that. I think I can't tell you, I don't personally know how accurate it would be, but I think it will definitely give you some good examples.
Okay, I just want to mention one, maybe just to wrap this up, and I think it's one of the reasons why we've had so many people sign up for this webinar today. Stuart from Singapore asks, the response to ChatGPT has included many predictions of several varieties of catastrophe. Why do you think the response has been so unhinged?
Hang on, I didn't quite catch that. Can you say it again?
Okay, the response to ChatGPT has included many predictions of several varieties of catastrophe. Why do you think the response has been so unhinged?
Interesting. I don't know. I think I think for many years, like, AI has been the subject of science fiction, hasn't it? It's like we've all feared, like, what would happen if the robots took over? What would happen if? So I think, yeah, with as we get closer and closer to human-like intelligence in AI, then I think, yeah, there's this kind of tendency to our imaginations to run wild about where it could lead us.
I think we can only, we have to look back at history and say every time there is a new technology that's come out, there is always a panic that it's going to replace mankind. I mean, when computers came out, I think people had the same fear that all jobs would be replaced by computers. Right?
Nobody would have any work anymore. It would be all done.
But in fact, it has generated new work. And you've said there, prompt engineers, for example. And this is just a new one. I'm sure there are going to be more avenues to expand mankind's input.
I just think the more tools we have, like for speeding up things, like say, even just in the field of research, if we have tools for speeding up how quickly we can analyze large amounts of data, textual analysis, numerical analysis, whichever, like it's speeding up, and that means that we can do more sophisticated things in our research. So it doesn't mean to say it's going to stop. It doesn't mean to say it's going to take over our jobs. It just is going to make things so much faster and so much easier. I think we just have to see the positive side of it and work with that.
You're right. And this is very early days as well, isn't it, for AI, for this type of generative?
Very, very early days, yeah. And as I say, we're not converted yet in terms of editing, but that's just because we see
time will tell
problems in
right.
the work that we do with it. But yeah, for many other things, it's great.
Okay, I think that wraps up. Any other questions that anyone might have at this point? What we'll do is we will save this recording and we'll put it up on our website so you can review it afterwards. So some of those examples that Rachel had in her PowerPoint were perhaps difficult to read as we're going through. You'll be able to pause the video and read them and get more insights from what the material that she's covered today. We'll share that with you later on. It just leaves it for us to say thank you very much for those who've attended this evening. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you very much, Rachel, for your afternoon, isn't it? in Italy.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, in the UK, sorry. And Felix in the background, any final words?
No, thanks, Rachel, for a wonderful presentation. And yeah, just a special exclusive discount for everybody who's attended this webinar. I've posted this in the chat as well. If you use the code AI webinar until August 31st, you can get 15% off on any of our editing services. And as Rachel just mentioned, even if you are using AI for writing or editing, you can definitely benefit from having a human pair of eyes go through it before submission. Yes, and with the GRF season coming up, we especially wish our Hong Kong clients and anybody actually applying for the GRF grants all the very best, and we look forward to helping you with your submissions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Felix. So thank you very much, and I wish you all the very best with your future research and writing, and indeed editing of that writing too. Thank you. Goodbye.